We would like to welcome Father John Afendoulis from the St. Demetrios Greek Orthodox Church in Fall River. And he spent quite a bit of time in Greece and at various holy sites. And he has a particular experience with the feast that we commemorate today, the feast of the life-giving spring. So we would like him to share that with us at this time. Father John, nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Father Nick.
Thank you.
Christos Anesti.
Halitos Anesti.
Christos Anesti, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Father Andrew invited me to the feast last year. I think that he knew that my Christians in Fall River are few, and so sometimes I plan for Divine Liturgy, and when I come, no one shows up, and then I can't have a Divine Liturgy. So he invited me last year, and I brought my icon that I have from the back. It's a sketch. It's from my grandmother. My grandmother was taken with her mother in it must have been 1914. She was 10 years old. And my great-grandmother needed an operation. And so she went from our village in Cappadocia, Semendere, to Constantinople, to Istanbul. And there my great-grandmother had her operation. Then because of the turmoil that was going, and by the time she recuperated, the genocide of the Armenians, my great-grandmother had relatives also in Constantinople. They stayed in Constantinople. My grandmother's recollections in Constantinople as a young girl, she loved the church of Zoodochos Pigi, that in Turkish they call Balukli, and in Greek we refer to it as Balukli. And so, but also in our village in Cappadocia, we had three churches. Our village in Semendere. Semendere is a little bit northeast of Nigde, which is between Caesarea and Iconium. I've been twice to those parts. We had three churches in our village. One was to the Archangel Michael, one was to the, and today that church still stands, but it's a mosque. We had to the Hagia Macrina. This Saint Macrina was the sister of Saint Basil the Great, who lived a little bit after the martyrdom of the 5 martyrs who celebrate on December 13th. Those saints are Evstratios, Oxendios, Eugenios, Mardarios, and Orestes. And on the same day, about 6 years later, martyred Saint Lucia in Sicily during the time of the Emperor Heraclius, is that the relics of Saint Lucia were transferred from Sicily to Cappadocia. So she was in the church of Hagia Macrina. So Saint Macrina comes in after the martyrs had been buried in my grandparents' village. And she started a little monastery there, and it was always known as the Church of Hagia Macrina, Macrina. And so we said, and the third church was to Zoodochos Pigi, which is just, doesn't act as a mosque today, doesn't act as a museum, it's a warehouse, Zoodochos Pigi. And my grandmother said that was the favorite of the three churches that they had. She said that, and my grandmother, together with my grandmother's sister, so my grandmother went, as I said, to Constantinople in 1914, but my grandmother's sister, her elder sister, stayed in the village with my great-great-grandmother, her grandmother. And so I know it seems to be confusing. Then my grandmother was still in Constantinople. Her sister remained in the village until the time of the destruction of Asia Minor, the Andalayi, as some people call it, the exchange of population. It was the destruction of Asia Minor. We lost all of our churches and all of our holy sites and our properties and our lands To this day, we're in the 21st century. We even have lost Hagia Sophia, now is returned back as a jami in Constantinople, where before it was a museum and we could at least go inside and worship as Orthodox Christians. So, my grandmother visited Balukli very often, and then the cemetery is also there, and some of our relatives were also in the cemetery, as the patriarchs are also buried there. And so she received that paper when, the story is a little bit interesting. My great uncle, my grandfather's first cousin, went to Detroit, Michigan in 1910. He was a little bit older than my grandfather by about 25 years. And he went and he started a little restaurant out of Detroit, Michigan, right across the street from Ford's automobile factory. But he needed helpers, so he kept calling, and my grandfather decided to leave in 1920 our village, because he was of the ripe age that had he remained in the village, he would have got conscripted into the Turkish army to fight his Greek brothers, and he didn't want to do that. So he left Cappadocia and he came to America to join his cousin. In the meantime, as we know, 1921, Smyrna was burnt down by the Turks, and Archbishop Chrysostom was martyred by the Turks. And then they did what they called the exchange of populations, all of the villages. And as we know, if you visit Greece, any city that's called Nea something, Nea Mudanya, Nea Simandra, Nea Smyrni, those were all original Asia Minor villages that went refugee. And so we went refugee in 1924. We were some of the last villages, being that Cappadocia was so far east, is they didn't worry too much, and they were worried about getting the other villages out, because, as you know your history, the Greeks had an army on the east coast, on the west coast, and they were advancing towards Ankara. That Ataturk had now made the new capital of Turkey. He moved it from Constantinople, where the sultans had their capital, and moved it inland. And so my grandmother used to go, So my grandfather then joined his first cousin, and they had this little restaurant outside of in Detroit, outside of Ford's automobile factory. And one day, my Theo Nico, he turns to my grandfather and he says, this was after the exchange of population, 1924. They resettled us. We went to Thessaloniki. We waited in Thessaloniki for 3 months until they could decide on what village we should take. And they asked us what type of village, and they would do comparisons. They'd say, okay, your village in Asia Minor had 300 homes. We have a village here that has 300 homes. Do you want that home? And they went to the Papudas and they asked them questions. And they said, what kind of village do you want? Because we have Halkidiki area. We can give you beach city, or we can give you a little bit more inland, and we'll give you Khorafia for every family, and you can plant olive trees. And our great-grandparents had said, we don't know seafaring, and our children are going to die in the ocean, so give us inland. The great-grandchildren now are wondering what was in their minds, because we could have all had beach property in northern Greece. Our village is Nea Simandra, and now they've simplified it to Semendere. I'm sorry, it was Nea Semendere, and now it's Simandra. And it's a little bit south of Vavdos. And Vavdos, Archbishop Dimitri, if you remember, he said, Vavdos is where I was born, and my brother. His brother is a professor at Aristotelio in Thessaloniki. So, but Vavdos is a Dopia village. It's not a refugee village. Their roots go back, they're pure Greeks. We're Asia Minor Greeks. So the village was there. So Theo Nico goes back to the village, and he sees my grandmother's sister, Thea Despina. They called her Daisy in America. Ellis Island gave her the name of Daisy. So she goes to Detroit, and the three of them are working the restaurant. And one day, Thea Despina, she turns to my grandfather and she says, Eftimi, you remember my sister Maria? Why don't you marry her? I'm lonely. And my grandmother says, you know what? She's not too skinny. I'll go back and see. So my papu writes his father, Papu Sava, in the village. Now we went to the village of Nea Semendere. And then it was a small village, so everybody knew each other. And he says, what about marrying Despina's sister? So my great-grandfather then writes a letter to Papu Oxendius, who is my great-grandfather in Constantinople. And so they sent my grandmother. Among her possessions was that sketch of Balukli that we have out in the front. I had it framed many years ago when my grandmother gave it to me. And that was one of her favorite. And I forgot to tell you, she loved the feast of Zoodochos Pigi at the village because she said it was a wonderful time. It was springtime and the flowers were blooming and everything. She said the Feast of the Five Martyrs is December 13th. We're in the fast period. It's winter time. We couldn't have a proper panigiri. And she said, but we had a big panigiri for Zoodochos Pigi in the village in Cappadocia. And then she says, of course, when you go to the church of Vlacherna in Constantinople, she says, of course, all of the Greeks in Constantinople had a festival. And the relatives that came from Semendra and landed in Nea Simandra, they also kept, and to this day, they have a big, big spread. It's the village has grown to almost 60,000 people. There's Jehovah's Witnesses, unfortunately. There's now Muslims, although none of the Muslims have erected a mosque yet in the village. They feed anybody that comes to the church. Father Evangelos is a good friend of mine. He's from Crete, but he loves the people, and he makes candles and he sells the candles, and that's how he supports himself also. And so my grandfather then goes to Nea Simandra and he marries my grandmother and he brings her to America, and now the two sisters are reunited, and the two cousins are getting along quite well. And my grandparents produced 6 children. My mother was the eldest, and she was named for my grandfather's mother, Magdalene. And so they all were together until a while where most of the Greeks were moving out of Detroit and going to Pontiac, Michigan, where we had the Church of St. George. And so there we have most of the Semendrians went. Oh, there's other stories that I could tell you about Papa Agathangelos, who was also from the same parts in Cappadocia, a little neighboring village. He baptized my mother. He was an icon painter. I have an icon of the Holy Five Martyrs in St. Lucia by his hand. Many people have seen it. And so they came to Detroit and they raised their children, and later they all went to Pontiac, Michigan. Theo Nico died just a year after I was born. And my mother and Theo Nico were very, very tight. As most of you know, the Greek culture, girls are not treated too well in the families. And everybody wants a boy to carry on the family name, etc. My mother was the firstborn of my grandparents, but not only. My mother was the firstborn of all of her first cousins. And so my grandfather had to write a letter back to his father that said that the firstborn is a girl. Theo Nico loved my mother. None of you here can remember those days. I remember from my mother telling me they used to go to the cinema on Saturdays for a nickel, for 5 cents. Oh, I take my boys now and it's close to $20. They want a popcorn, 50 cents worth of popcorn. They charge me $12. What is that all about? And Theo Nico used to give my mother a quarter, and she would give her 5 brothers. He would give the 5 brothers a nickel. And they were all jealous of my mother, who was very loving to her brothers, and she used to buy candy and stuff for them out of her extra 20 cents. So they lived in harmony, the 2 families. And then what happened is that Thea Despina, her son goes to Thessaloniki and studies with Father John Romanidis. He started off at the seminary, but you know, our family was Turkish speaking. So back in those years, in the 60s, the priest had to be able to speak Greek. And they had to know Greek so well, not just liturgical Greek, they had to be able to give confession. We grew up in a Turkish-speaking family. And even the priest that we sort of had, Papagathangelos, I have his books. They're written in Karamalidika. Karamalidika is the Turkish language written with Greek characters. And I have his service books, and I have 2 of his gospels, his small gospels that he have. And so Thea Despina then was widowed. My uncle Demetrios went to Thessaloniki and studied theology because he couldn't learn Greek at the seminary here in Boston, because the boys only took 1 class of Greek, and then they all spoke English afterwards. My grandfather says, you have to go to Thessaloniki, and you can study there. My sister is there, my brothers are there. And so my uncle Demetrios went to Thessaloniki. He went to Mount Athos many times. He was very close with the synodia of Father Haralambos. Father Haralambos, as many of you might know, was a spiritual child of Saint Joseph the Hesychast. And so my uncle went many times. Father Arsenius, who was the co-ascetic with Saint Joseph, was also at Burazeri at the time. And I visited Burazeri when the elder Arsenius was still living. He actually gave me a prayer rope, a 300-knot prayer rope that I use every day. And so now we go back. And so when Uncle Dimitri was in Thessaloniki, because my aunt was widowed, she went and lived with him in Thessaloniki for 2 years. And she says, Dimitri, let's go to Cappadocia. She says, to the place where I was raised and I spent my first 19 years in life. I was born there. The saints' relics are still there. And she says, let's go so that I can see the place one last time. When we go back to America, who knows if I'm ever going to come back to Greece again. So they did. What I forgot to tell you was in 1924, when they announced to our village on Tuesday that on Friday they would march them down to the seashore and take them and send them off to Greece, is the priests, the 3 priests that we had in the village immediately started uncovering the relics of the 5 martyrs. And they put them all in 1 box. Unfortunately, they were not too smart, really, because they got to Greece and then they didn't know who was who. So I even have relics of the 5 martyrs, but we don't know from whom I have the relics. There's a nun that was in the village, a great-great-aunt to my grandfather. And she had a vision one night, and the vision was that a woman came to her and said that she's not going to leave right now, the village, but many years later, someone is going to help her come out of the village. And so she went and told the priest this. She says, I saw a woman in my dream, and she says she's not going to leave. The priest said, you're getting a little senile, you don't really understand too much. And so they didn't pay much attention. When they uncovered the relics of the 5 martyrs, the ground came up very, very loose. And when they went to Ayelukia's relics, the ground was like a marble. It couldn't be budged. And they said, maybe the nun Christina, maybe she did see, maybe, let's not, if we can't get the ground up, we have other things to do, things that we have to gather and take. So they left St. Lucia. So then after World War II, other Christians went, still they could not budge the ground that St. Lucia was in. And then, so my aunt convinces my uncle, her son, And so we had some relatives still in Constantinople, and so Aki was our cousin on my great-grandmother's side, and he had he was very rich, and so he had a driver, and so he gave us his car and a driver, and they went down to Nigde, where they entered into a hotel. And Theodespina had a vision that night. She was a little girl in the village, and she said, I was in the church of Ai Macrina. She said, and a woman came to me and gave me an Easter egg and said, Christos Anesti. And Theodespina woke up in the morning, she told her son, Demetrios, she says, I think something good's going to happen today. And they went to the village, and of course Theodespina knew the Turkish language very well, and so she spoke with the inhabitants of the village. After we left in 1924, of course, all the Turks came in and they took over our houses and our properties, etc. And then she spoke with the woman. The woman that had the property was the daughter of the woman that originally had the property of Ai Macrina. And the woman had provata, had sheep. And so in the nighttime, she used to take the sheep and she used to put it inside of the church to protect it from the elements. And about 4 months after that they were in the village, she said her daughter's now telling my aunt the story, or that her mother said that she had a vision, and 5 men came to her, and one spoke to her and said, this is a holy place, take your sheep out of here. And the woman didn't think anything of it. She said, I ate something funny and now I had a vision. The next night, the men came back and they had sticks, and they said, if you don't take your sheep out of here, we're going to beat you. She got very scared. And they said, this is holy land, holy grounds, keep it very clean. From that time on, she took the sheep out, and it was spotless. So this Theodespina went to the Jerusalem for Pascha 2 times in her life. And she went with a group of pilgrims. You know, in Jerusalem, they give you a bunch of 33 candles, and it has like a little icon of Jesus Christ on the outside. So Theodimitri, he took the candles with it. He was religious. He knew the church service, etc. So when they went to the morning after Theodespina has the vision, and so she says he chants a little bit from Christos Anesti. He chants a little bit the Gisaion service. You want me to cut it, don't you? Yeah, okay, I'm almost done. And so then I lost my train of thought. So the woman got scared because, you know, that bunch of candles really has a big flame to it. And it was a little bit of wax was dripping. And then that's when she told them her mother had that vision. She had to keep the place very clean. So they were very careful not to drip the wax. They started to unearth where Aia Lukia was, and the ground just came up loose. And when they finally came to the relics, and they found the relics, but they did not find a head. And it wasn't until many, many years later, I was at Holy Transfiguration Monastery, and they found some documents in a French monastery that said that we lost the relics of Saint Lucia, but we kept her eyes. And that was another way of saying that they kept her head. So her head remained in Sicily, but her body went, and that's why. But my uncle Demetrios had his skepticism. And he says, I'm not sure if it's human bones, maybe it's provata, maybe it's animal bones. So there was a doctor at Thessaloniki, Alexander Kalomiros, and he said, definitely they're human bones. Now, whether they're the relics of St. Lucia, I don't know. My uncle took him to Burazeri, to Mount Athos. And Father Arsenius says, do the service for the washing of the bones. And they do that for the fathers there. And when they poured the red wine on the relics to wash off the dirt and things, the elder Arsenius turned to my uncle Demetrius and says, look at the bowl. My uncle Demetrius told me this firsthand. And he says, I looked inside the bowl, the red wine was golden. It was white wine after it washed the relics of the saint. And this was a miracle. The elder Arsenius told my uncle Demetrios, this miracle is for you because you doubted whether it was indeed the relics of St. Lucia. And so the relics were distributed in the village that we had. Some of the relics were brought to Pontiac, Michigan, where we, have a nice church. My aunt finagled from the priest in our village, my grandfather's youngest sister, finagled from the priest in the village to give her some relics. And when I arrived to Greece in 2002, this Theophrosos, she turned to me and she says, you have to take the relics out of my home. And she says, you keep them. And I said, Theophrosos, I said, they're your relics, you keep them. No, she says, my end is coming. This is in September, the Feast of the Cross. And she says, my end is coming. She says, I'm not sure how long I'm going to live. My daughters are not religious. I don't know what's going to happen to the relics. You take them and safeguard them. And they were, she had them in a little case, and they were labeled, the 5 martyrs, that she didn't know who was who. And then Ayia Lucia, which she did know, and that was from her sister-in-law's findings. That's the relics, that's the story of the 5 martyrs. It's a little bit extended from Balukli, but all of those are in honor of my great-grandmother. And what I neglected to say last year, I think, my grandmother loved the feast. She went on the feast of Ipapandi to Southern California, where I was studying at UCLA. She had one of her sons there. And they had, so my grandmother's great-great-granddaughter was being baptized on the feast of Ipapandi. So she went to the baptism. The next morning it was Sunday, and she threw up a little bit. My grandmother was 94 years old. And so she went into the hospital. And she kept having little heart attacks, etc. And so they kept her in quite, it got to the point that she couldn't eat or speak at all. She was basically and then I would go down and visit her from UCLA, but she was in Irvine, California, so it was a little bit of a trek for me. And they called me, and she was always stable. She wasn't speaking. And then she reposed on Zoodochos Pigi, her favorite feast day. And I found that to be a sign. And always, every year, I have it as a memorial for my dear grandmother. We were very close. And I'm one of the few of the grandchildren that she gave me her recipes. So I cook according to her. Even the koliva recipe in Fall River. Oh, Father John, you make such a good koliva. I can't take credit for it. My grandmother trained me how to make koliva. So may we remember all of those Christians that went before us in the time when Christians are becoming few. Our children, our grandchildren, they're all walking away from the church and their belief in God. Some of us tell us, oh, I believe in God, I just don't like going to church, Father John. Or we have too many things. We have baseball, and we have basketball, and football, and soccer. It's our job as parents. We're given children as stewards, and we need to be good stewards, and we need to do only one thing for our children, and that's to raise them to fear God. And this is what my mission is, that my boys grow up to learn to love God and to fear God and to come to church. May we all pray for all of our relatives and all of those that have gone before us that kept the faith that we have today. God bless them all. And may we find our salvation so that we have a good Christian ending. Thank you for listening and allowing me to honor my dear grandmother and those saints that have come from our village. I know Father Andrew always remembers my boys because his granddaughter is named Lucia. And so, we have a common thing there because it's that Saint Lucia, Saint Lucy that was buried in our village that I have relics, and my relics are in a little reliquary box on my altar table with one of the 5 martyrs that I don't know. I also have a little relics in that little box of Saint John Maximovich. That's another story. Christos Anesti.
Christos Anesti. Thank you, Father John. Tu Kyrie eleison.